everyone. Welcome to our March History Talks. Thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Felicia Rova-Cameron, and I'm the Associate Curator at the Lacey Museum. I am also joined by our Adjunct Curator, Olivia Moore, who will be moderating the virtual part of the presentation at the back of the room. We are joined tonight by historian and author Drew Crooks for a presentation about Chief Leschi, Governor Isaac Stevens, and the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854. For those of you here in person tonight, if you haven't already, we'd really appreciate if you would sign in after the conclusion of tonight's presentation, as this helps us get an accurate count of attendance. You can also use that form to sign up for our newsletter, and we will keep you posted about current updates. Before we begin tonight's presentation, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement and some museum news. The Lacey Museum is on the ancestral land of the tribal people of the Treaty of Medicine Creek, including the Nisqually Indian Tribe and Squaxin Island Tribe. We acknowledge and remember those tribal people not recognized today who were absorbed or relocated into other tribes for survival. We recognize the ancestors and their descendants who are still here. We recognize and respect the tribal people of the Treaty of Medicine Creek as traditional stewards of this land since time immemorial, and their role today is taking care of these lands in perpetuity. We recognize and have the responsibility to call attention to the histories of dispossession, forced removal, and abridged treaty rights that allowed our nation, state, and city to develop as they have today. We recommend that community members read the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854. With the museum being open, we have Creativity Corner going again. So this is a free craft program for all ages. So this month you can craft your own bumblebee, and in April, join us to paint your own wooden egg. So Creativity Corner is open during museum hours, Thursdays and Fridays, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., and then Saturdays, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. So come join us, do a fun craft, visit the museum. We are holding a special event on April 23rd from 5:30 p.m. to 7 p.m. called Sharing Our Food Stories. This is an oral history workshop with window seat media that will be held at the Lacey Museum site. So join us for an evening of reflecting, sharing, and writing about our food traditions. Participants learn tips for documenting and writing about your family's food history and stories. Bring an object that connects in some way to your food story. This could be a cooking utensil, a recipe card, an ingredient, or something else entirely. This workshop is offered in conjunction with our rotating guest exhibit, Stories of Food, Food is Story, curated by Window Seat Media, that is on display at the Lacey Museum and Cultural Center through the end of April. So limited space is available for this program, so registration is required, so make sure to reserve your spot. We hope you'll join us next month for our April History Talk with author Janine Gates as she presents her book, Saving the Nisqually Delta. Now I would like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Drew Crooks. So Drew received a bachelor's degree in history and anthropology and a master's degree in museum studies from the University of Washington. For over 35 years, he has worked with various museums in South Puget Sound, written numerous articles and 5 books on the region's heritage, and presented history talks to school classes and community groups. Thank you, Drew, for joining us this evening.
Hello? There. Oh, hello. Can you hear me in the back okay? Oh, good. Move up just a little bit. I'm very happy to be here today. History is something I really like, and this story, the story of Chief Leschi, Governor Isaac Stevens, and the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854 is, I think, one of the most interesting stories that come out of our regional history. First, I'd like to thank the Lacey Museum, Felicia and Aaron for inviting me to talk here tonight. And also I'd like to thank my family, Karen and Jennifer, for their support of my history work. One thing I should mention is that when I first gave my first talk on Medicine Creek, it was in 1984 at a conference at Camp Murray. And I'm glad it was dark when the lights were off when I was talking to show the slides of that time. I'm glad it was dark because I was shaking so much no one could see me shake. But anyway, years later, I'm still learning about the treaty. And there's no way I could do this talk tonight without the knowledge, the information gained by other historians and anthropologists. And I'd like to particularly think of two historians tonight. One is Cecilia Carpenter, who was a historian for the Nisqually tribe. She passed away in 2010, I'm sorry to say. But she wrote extensively about Leschi and the history of the Nisqually people. The second historian would be Kent Richards. He's a retired professor at Central Washington University, and he wrote a book about Isaac Stevens in 1979, Isaac Stevens, Young Man in a Hurry. And that's kind of a key source of information that gives a balanced view of this complicated individual. So my thanks to Cecilia and to Kent. Sometimes I'm told that history has no impact today, that the past is the past and we're the present. The story of the Medicine Creek Treaty and the people involved in it is a great example of how history has great influence on us today and probably long into the future. But let's go back into time and take a look at the two peoples in Washington Territory at that time. Okay. By the 1850s, there were two major groups of people living in Washington, what is now Washington State, Washington Territory then. One would be the Native Americans. They had lived here no one knows how long, thousands of years at least. And they were divided into different groups, different bands, different villages, different tribes. This is a famous photograph by Edward Curtis showing a Skokomish or Tawana summer camp. It was staged by Curtis, but it's recognized by the tribes as being realistic. And in fact, when you go to the Skokomish Tribal Center, you'll see a giant copy of this photograph on display. The native tribes had lived here for thousands of years. They developed a culture attuned with nature, rich in culture, their own way of life. And I always felt that in this area, probably one of the most interesting cultural elements that they did was basket weaving. And this is a basket made by the master basket maker, Nancy Jim Parsons, Callis Nisqually. And it's a great basket. It's up in the Washington State Historical Society. But the one thing that was different, their society from Western society, from the settlers, was the way of government. There was no tribal council in those days, back in the 1850s. There were not really even tribes as we see it. There were villages that had maybe a headman who was chosen to in a sense lead the village, but they were not elected leaders. They were not like they told with great authority what everyone did. It was more like a person that would be in charge of general things. And so each village was independent. In normal times, there were no tribal leaders of these groups. And then we come to Chief Leschi. I call him Chief because among the Nisqually people and among many people, it's a sign of respect to identify him as that. Leschi was born about 1808 up at Michelle, where the Nisqually and the Michelle Creek enter the Nisqually River. It's now a state park, interestingly enough. And it was a village that was half Nisqually and half Yakima, Sahapton. The people that grew up in that village would be bilingual in Lushootseed, the Nisqually tongue, and then also in the Sahapton or Yakima language. Both Leschi and his half-brother, Quaymuth, were born in that village. Later in life, they would spend a long time along Mud Creek and the Nisqually River. And they became known as kind of leaders in their community, in the Native community. I have a nice quote from Ezra Meeker, who was a pioneer and actually quite sensitive to Native culture. In 1905, he wrote a book, and in the book he says, Leschi was but a common citizen of the Nisqually tribe, yet one of influence and universally liked. He had, as if by common consent, become what might be termed a judge or arbitrator who held court without law and whose judgment was without appeal. But he was over and above all a sensible citizen of wealth and one whose word commanded respect. So he was a natural leader, and like his brother, Quaymuth. I'll call him brother, even though half-brother. In that society, a half-brother and brother was about the same. And they were natural leaders. And Leschi, when the Hudson's Bay Company came, the fur traders, and when the American settlers came, Leschi and Quaymuth actually worked quite well with them, with the early settlers. They were known as community leaders, responsible, sensible people, and were treated with some respect because of that. So on one hand, you have Leschi coming out of the Native culture. And then you have the people coming into this area, starting in the 1840s into the 1850s. And they have many names. Pioneers is one. I prefer American settlers. They came from mostly by land over the Oregon Trail. I used to joke that the rich ones came by ship and everyone else came by the trail, over the Oregon Trail. And they came over here from the Midwest and from the East Coast looking for a better way of life. I think it's important to look at both sides with compassion and sympathy. The people that came across in the Oregon Trail, it was such a hard journey over here that no one would do it unless they were, in a sense, desperate or determined or both. Because it was, they left everyone behind. They came over here, they wanted to improve their way of life, and I think we need to see, just like the Native people, see the oncoming settlers with some compassion on why they came. By 1853, Washington was a territory separate from Oregon, very sparsely populated by the settlers, and even the native populations were very sparse compared to today. I think I've heard of numbers like 9,000 settlers in the whole territory, 20 to 25,000 Native Americans in the whole territory. So very sparse populations. And the thing is, one of the reasons that settlers came over here was the promise of land, to own your own land was crucial. And to encourage settlement, the U.S. government promised land to the settlers through the donation land law, that if they would come and settle, they could get free land. In the beginning, it was extremely generous, 320 acres for a single man, 640 for a married couple. Later, it got less generous, and then pretty soon you had to pay some for the land. So they're coming over here for the land, but at the same time, the land was still legally owned by the Native Americans. Now, I could imagine in many places of the world, they would say, who cares? We'll just take in the land. The United States has always had kind of a determined, harsh attitude, and also, at the same time, a legalistic, more sympathetic attitude. And there were people who felt that it would be unjust to just take the land, so it was needed to buy the land. Now, how this came into operation and stuff, that's another story, but to buy the land. And so the idea was to set up a treaty system in which the U.S. government bought the land from the Native Americans, and it was done through a treaty. And the person sent here to handle that is Isaac Stevens. Very different than Leschi. He came from New England, born in Andover, Massachusetts, I think about 1818. He was a very small man, but intellectually very smart. And he went to West Point, graduated first in his class, went into engineers, military engineers. He was in the war with Mexico and was involved in different campaigns in that conflict. And then he joined the military engineers. And then in 1853, he had been involved in politics a little bit, and he supported President Pierce in his campaign for the office. So in return for that, he was appointed governor of Washington Territory, the first governor. And he came out as to be the governor. At the same time, he was superintendent of Indian Affairs, given the job of negotiating with the Native Americans. And at the same time, he was exploring a land route for a railroad going through the northern part of the United States. So he was a busy man. Now here's a description of Isaac Stevens by Kent Richards, written in his book, Isaac Stevens, Young Man in a Hurry, 1979. Virtually all who knew him agree that he possessed a brilliant mind, enormous energy, and a dominant personality. These characteristics were highly respected in the 19th century, particularly on the American frontier. A Minnesota newspaperman best captured the admiration for Stevens' character when he praised him as a true representative of the times, a regular go-ahead man, but others castigated him as a Napoleonic dictator with delusions of grandeur and a narrow egotism that brooked no criticism or opposition. Stevens' career reflected these divergent opinions. He acquired many loyal friends, but he also engaged in monumental feuds. Obviously not really suitable for to be a negotiator. But he was extremely intelligent. I think sometimes he's put down, but he was an extremely intelligent person, a capable person, a driven person. So he came out, and in some ways he did the work of three people. So he came to Washington, to Olympia, and he recognized, he knew about the conflict that was developing. The Native Americans legally owned the land. The American settlers wanted the land, or at least much of the land, most of the land. So how to do this? Through the treaty system. Now, it's not like Stevens could just do any treaty he wanted to. He was basically told and given examples of what he was supposed to do. And one thing they encouraged was to be as thrifty and economical as possible in doing these treaties. And that, I think, was the cause of much of the trouble. You look here, Washington Territory is on the north, of course, and Oregon below it. And of course, it's different than what it is today. It goes all the way up to the Rocky Mountains. So at the very beginning, he's tasked to do these treaties. And he knows he's not going to do one treaty for everyone in the territory. He's going to do treaties in different parts of the territory with groups of Native Americans. And logically, he picked an area close to Olympia, the territorial capital, a place called Medicine Creek. Medicine Creek is now known as McAllister Creek. And the native name was Shedonam, meaning Medicine Creek. And I was told once that its water was so good, it tasted like medicine. Though I sometimes think medicine tastes bad, but anyway. The truth is, it's called Medicine Creek because certain spirit power was traditionally believed to have been acquired around the creek. It's on the Nisqually Delta, very close to the Nisqually River in Thurston County. Anyway, so it's just at the Delta, and of course before you get to DuPont and Tacoma, it's in between. Anyway, the thing is, this was a logical place to meet because it was a kind of a meeting ground for Native people. It was a place you could easily get to by canoe and then by land too. So in December 1854, the council was held here. The people who participated in this were, of course, Isaac Stevens. He's kind of the main representative of the U.S. government at this council and of the American settlers. And in a way, his personality, his spirit is through the whole council. This person, George Gibbs, was the intellectual from New England, and he's considered one of the earliest anthropologists or ethnologists in the area. He was the one that drew up the treaty itself, and he was at the council. I think the neatest thing about him is that later in life, he lived in Washington, D.C., and he was involved with this early Smithsonian Institute. And in fact, he had an apartment in the museum, which I think is kind of neat, to actually live at, in the museum. But the least appealing part of him was, even though he was, quote, an anthropologist, he had very little knowledge of Native American. He did not speak their language, and he seemed to have not very much sympathy for them. So that's too bad. And then we get to Quaymuth. And I think Quaymuth is a person, he's the brother of Leschi, and the older brother. And his name means strong man in Lushootseed. Sometimes he's neglected in history, but I think he was a great influence on Leschi, on the Nisqually, and at the council. He was actually appointed. Stevens needed people to negotiate with, so he appointed Quaymuth's chief and Leschi's sub-chief of the Nisqually. And that sounds very arbitrary, like I would say, okay, you're chief, you're sub-chief of the Nisqually, you're head of the Skokomish. No, actually, he got advice from people like Dr. Tomey at Fort Nisqually on who to pick. And I think these were good choices. At the council, Quaymuth and Leschi were the major Nisqually leaders. There was also people from the Puyallup tribe and the Squaxin tribe, too. And here's Leschi, another drawing of him. There's no photograph of Leschi. There's no drawing that seems close to his time period. When I see the Quaymuth one, it looks very real to me, like this is how Quaymuth looked. Leschi looks more what people think he thought he looked like. Anyway, he was there too. And so you had 600 Indians there, Native Americans there, and it was a large group, about 15 settlers, Euro-Americans there. This is what the site looked like in 1914. You see those trees? Those are the treaty trees. it looked like a very quiet place, but it was a good meeting place. And they met beginning December 24th and went through December 26th. And when I've given this a talk to school kids, they would say, well, what about Christmas? Well, at that time in America, many people, particularly from New England, did not celebrate Christmas as we celebrate today. And particularly Isaac Stevens was how would you say it? I would say a non-religious person, pragmatic in things, and they just worked right through that time. Anyway, they met for three days. The first day when they came, they just got there. They just got adjusted to there. The second day, on the 25th, Stevens had the provisions of the treaty read to the assembled group. Now, you may say, how could they understand it? Well, it was very difficult. And what happened is Stevens would say one article of the treaty. It would be translated, I think, by B.F. Shaw into Chinook jargon. And then it was translated by by a Native American from Chinook jargon into Lushootseed. And then if someone from the Native Americans had something to say, they would say Lushootseed, Chinook jargon, English. Not a great way to do it. And Chinook jargon was a trade language, very small vocabulary. Now, I'm talking about Chinook jargon in the 1850s. I'll add something to this in a minute. Basically used to say, I want the horse, pay 3 blankets for the horse, you can have the horse, here's the horse. I mean, for basic business transaction. Now, in recent years, on the Grand Round Reservation in Oregon, Chinook jargon has become a full language. It has expanded. It's used in daily life. It's different. It's not the Chinook jargon of the 1850s. And the reason they did that was because on that reservation in Oregon, there's tribes with different languages, so they needed a language that everyone could speak. Anyway, the first day they went through it, the provisions and of the treaty, and the third day, Isaac Stevens stood up and said, basically, the Great Father in Washington D.C. Wants the best for you. This is the treaty. Do you agree to the treaty? And then, according to the official record, the chiefs and sub-chiefs and the leaders went and they put an X by their name, and the treaty was signed. And then Isaac Stevens and that group would sign it too. And in the book written by Isaac's son, Hazard Stevens, he writes, they agreed to it. The treaty was signed. They sent it back to Washington, D.C. It was agreed to by the U.S. Senate. And then the president signed it in 1855, and it becomes the law, right? Well, is that what happened? I mean, there's Hazard Stevens. Many people believe it's much more complicated. And I have to admit, I wished Ezra Meeker would have written a book closer to the time period, but in about 1900, he wrote this book, Pioneer Reminiscences of Puget Sound and the Tragedy of Leschi. And in this one, he said that the treaty was not, the council was not like that. That what happened was when they read the provisions, a group of the Native Americans thought, well, that's the best we can get. A group of them did not understand what was going on at all, but there was a vocal group that opposed the provisions of the treaty, led by Leschi. It appears that Quaymuth was ignored by Governor Stevens. That's some evidence of that. but that Leschi spoke up and said, he's supposed to say, and the native witnesses that told Ezra this story, Leschi stood up and said, I don't accept this this treaty, ripped up his appointment as sub-chief and left. Okay. There's no sign of this in the official record. We're depending on memories 50 years later. So it's hard to say exactly what happened, but from the evidence of what the events that followed the council and the signing of the treaty, that many people at the council were opposed to it. What's interesting, of course, is on the treaty, which is back in Washington, D.C., you see X's by every name. But, it's easy to make an X, too. Okay, there's Ezra Maker. So we come to the treaty. Even whether people opposed it or they supported it, the treaty went back to D.C. It was officially approved. The president, the Senate approved it, the president signed it, it became official. And the treaty itself is very short. It's 13 articles. And the basic, most important provision as seen by the United States and by the settlers was that in the treaty, the Native Americans ceded 2,240,000 acres of land. That would be, as you can see here, most of all of Thurston County, part of Pierce County, part of Mason County. Well, it'd be all of Pierce County and part of Mason County and a little bit in King County. And they ceded it officially in return for payments in goods, which amounted to $32,500 in those days, to be paid over a period of years. Also for recognized reservations, which would include the Nisqually Reservation, the Puyallup Reservation, and the Squaxin Reservation, and then promises of federal aid like providing a doctor, a blacksmith, things like that, education too, teacher. It turned out the payment was not much for the Native Americans, and it was structured over a long period of time. The government services came reluctantly and slowly. The reservations that they received were very small. 1,280 acres per tribe. That would be like for the Squaxin, the Nisqually, and the Puyallup, and the Nisqually. Nisqually got particularly difficult land. It was a wooded land close to the Nisqually Delta, away from the water, kind of on the hillside. It was not really acceptable land. Other provisions in the treaty, there was one interesting one. It abolished slavery among the Native Americans, and they had slaves. So what's interesting is that slavery was abolished in the treaty, but then in the rest of the United States, of course, there's wide areas that had slaves in 1854. This is before the Civil War, emancipation, and all that. Well, once the treaty was signed, Stevens immediately, he was a man of action. He immediately went on to other councils, other treaties, all across the territory. And this is a map that shows part of it. It seems that as he went along, there was more and more opposition by the Native people. Perhaps they were realizing what this really meant. And particularly in eastern Washington, there was a lot of opposition to it. But Stevens is way away, busy doing this all through the territory. And remember, the territory goes all the way up to the Rocky Mountains. Conflict was developing. it was a tense, very tense time between the Native Americans and American settlers. As 1855, December 1854, going into 1855, there were signs that, and complaints by many different Native Americans, that the lands that they got for the reservations were not suitable, were not adequate. By October 1855, in eastern Washington, actual war had broken out by separate tribes, not directly connected to Puget Sound tribes. At this point, Stevens was away from the capital. He's over in eastern Washington. The acting governor, Charles Mason, who was just filling in, felt the full impact of this conflict. He was warned by different settlers that one of the leaders of the group against the treaty was Leschi. So in October 1855, he ordered a group of volunteer militiamen, the Eaton Rangers, to go out and arrest Leschi and Quaymuth and bring him into Olympia. When they went, Leschi and Quaymuth had heard about this. They fled. And so the war began after that. It was a time of great fear. This is a picture by of Sylvester Wendell, the artist Robert Chamberlain drew this, and working with Lynn Erickson. And it shows Olympia in about 1855, 56. And you see a blockhouse where Sylvester Park is, and you see a wooden palisade wall going across the peninsula of Olympia, kind of like 4th Avenue. Okay. The war consisted of skirmishes on both sides. It wasn't like a large battle. People were ambushed. People were shot individually. Not many casualties for the whole thing, but it was a brutal war. Atrocities were done on both sides. And in a way, it was a personal conflict, because oftentimes you knew the person you killed. It lasted from 1855 into 1856. By the spring of 1856, Leschi and Quaymuth and the native combatants, and in Puget Sound, it was mainly the part of the Nisqually and part of the Puyallup and the upper Duwamish. They went across the Cascade Mountains into eastern Washington, stayed there for a bit, and then they came back. Meanwhile, Stevens recognized that the reservations were too small. And so in August 1856, he met again on Fox Island, and he redrew the reservations area. And it was based on the provision in the Madison Creek Treaty that the reservations could be changed if the President of the United States approved it. And what he did was he gave the Puyallup tribe went from 1,280 acres to 22,000 acres. The Nisqually tribe reservation was pulled back to the Nisqually River, to the area that was more like closer to the river, on the river, and include prairie land too. And it was increased to 4,700 acres. The Squaxin, who didn't participate in the conflict, their reservation was remained the same. And so this change was sent to the Washington, D.C., and the president did approve it in 1857. This is Leschi's pistol during the war. And Leschi and Quaymuth and other Native Americans thought with a change in reservation, the ending of the skirmishes, that perhaps there was a place that they could come back to and life could resume back here in Puget Sound. Unfortunately for them, Isaac Stevens kept a grudge. And he considered the leaders of the Native Americans who fought against them as his personal enemies. So they came to a bad end, I guess you could say. Leschi was betrayed by some Native Americans and was captured and was brought to Olympia. He was taken up to Fort Steilacoom. He was tried for the murder of a militiaman during the war, and there was a mistrial. There was another trial, and then he was convicted, and then he was hung in February 1858. And even among many settlers, and particularly among the U.S. Army officers at Fort Steilacoom, and Dr. Tolmie, and of course many Native Americans, they thought this was judicial murder, that this shouldn't have been done. Quamuth turned himself in, was brought into Olympia, came in November 1856, and while waiting to be sent to Fort Steilacoom, someone broke into the Stevens back office and killed him. A real tragedy. Nothing was ever done with that. Okay. Among the Nisqually and Puyallup people, Leschi and Quamuth are seen as the heroes of the tribe. And in 1895, they had a reburial of their bodies. They buried them near the mouth of Mud Creek. And I'd like to point out, these people are identified. Bill Quamuth is on the left, and then from left to right is Luke, George Leschi, Yelm Jim, and Old Steilacoom. And on July 3rd, 1895, they were reburied. Leschi was reburied again in the Puyallup Tribal Cemetery by his daughter. Quamuth was reburied, but we don't know where. And according to Cecilia Carpenter, no one knows now. I think it's a personal family thing that happened, and it's not for public knowledge. This is a site where Quamuth was brought in and killed. And it was, of course, in 1856, it was the home and office of Governor Stevens. Later, he moved up to where the Capitol campus was, but this is where he was living in November 1856. It's the site of the Olympia Center, Olympia Community Center. This is up in Lakewood, near the site where Leschi was hung, and there's a monument there, marker to him. In 2004, there was a retrial of Leschi by the Washington State Supreme Court. It was not a legal trial, it was a historical trial. And they exonerated Leschi of murder because, as it was clearly pointed out, that during the wartime he was fighting as a soldier. It couldn't be considered murder. And a lawyer from JBLM was there and testified to that. I was at this meeting. This is when the news was announced that he was exonerated. That's, of course, the famous Billy Frank. And next to him on the right is Cynthia Ayel, who was, I think, tribal chair at the time. Quamuth, nothing has ever been done legally or anything for him. He never really had a trial. Back about 1995, there was the highest peak in Thurston County was given a name. And at that time, he had informal names, but no official name. So the Quamuth Peak became his name. And I was lucky enough to be on a trip there to visit the peak around that time. And this is the peak here. It's down in the southeast corner of the county, close to Lewis County boundary. And from there, you can kind of see the land, a lot of natural land. It's a nice view. Anyway, what happened with the reservation, what happened, Medicine Creek, the life of Chief Leschi, Governor Stevens, and had so much more impact beyond that time. And one thing I should mention, what happened to Stevens? He was elected territorial delegate to Congress for a couple of terms. When the Civil War broke out, he volunteered for the Union. He was made a general, and he died. Actually, he died as a hero in the Battle of Chantilly in 1862. He was with his unit, and the flag bearer of the U.S. flag was shot. So he grabbed the flag. He says, "Rally behind me," and he led them, and he was shot leading his troops. The reservations have had a complicated history. Let's see. Okay. Let's go to the Puyallup Reservation. Unfortunately for the Puyallup Reservation, it's right near Tacoma. So they had 22,000 acres of nice land right around Tacoma. As Tacoma expanded, the reservation was taken over. And they had this thing of allotment, and quote, the excessive land was sold to non-natives. By at one point, at the low point, only the cemetery was owned by the tribe. Since then, there's been a land settlement. They, of course, own much more land now. But they lost most of the reservation at one point. The Nisqually Reservation had a different fate. It's much smaller now than the 4,700 acres. In 1917, with the entrance of U.S. into World War I, Tacoma volunteered to give land for a military post, an army post. And they had elections in Pierce County, and the people voted to give the land. And this was not just land from the Native Americans, it was also American settler land too. The people that had the land were given a minimal payment, and then they were moved out. And so 2/3 of the reservation went to Camp Lewis. And this is still a sore point among descendants of the settlers that lived there, and also among Native Americans, the Nisqually tribe. Now, one of the interesting things about the treaty was that a part that I believe Stevens did not consider important was the fact that he knew that the Native Americans, they were hoping they would become farmers, but that would take time. So he, in the treaty, is promised the right for fishing rights, the right to hunt, different rights like that, so that the Native Americans could actually feed themselves in this transitional process. The truth is, the Nisqually, Puyallup, and even the Squaxin, they're fishing peoples, and they have continued to fish. And by the 1960s, because of different regulations and stuff, their fishing rights were curtailed. And so you had what you call the fish wars, in which there was many protests. Here's one at the state capitol in Olympia. Many protests to attain their rights. And the turning point in it is when it went through the judicial system, and in 1974, Judge Bolt ruled that the Native Americans' rights counted, that they needed to be an active part in management of fishing resources, and that they had up to 50% of the fish. And this was not accepted at first. There was constant court challenges. In 1979, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of this. And so that's why you have, I would say, a flourishing fishing industry among native tribes, and shellfish and like that. But what's interesting is that all this came from the Medicine Creek Treaty. Many things have marked the event of the Medicine Creek Council and the treaty. You have stone markers like this. This is one of my favorite, up on the hillside looking down on the delta. The marker put up by Timberland High School students in 1976. And you have other markers and stuff. But what's important is that, well, we'll come to that. But one of the most famous markers was actually a living marker for many years, the so-called treaty tree. Actually, there were a lot of treaty trees. Most were destroyed by the freeway, I-5, but this one survived, and only it became a snag, and then in 2006, it was blown down in a windstorm, and the wood was given to the Nisqually people. What's interesting, of course, is that it's not just the markers, it's not just the history. The fact is that what Chief Leschi, Governor Stevens did in 1854 at the council, the treaty, formed the basis of the legal right for descendants of the settlers to live here. So all the land here in Thurston County, this whole South Puget Sound region is legally American land because of the treaty. The whole reservation system is established, and including the rights for fishing and all that. But just the fact of federal recognition of the reservation system, all this legal basis comes from this treaty. What's interesting is that back in 1854, well over 100 years ago, well over 100 years ago, probably 150 years ago now, so much history was done there. These two peoples came together. They came to a treaty. It was a difficult treaty, difficult on the Native Americans. The conflict that followed was difficult, but this is the basis for our relations between Native and non-Native people in this whole area. And I remember going to the Nisqually Reservation once, and they had a sign, "We are a Medicine Creek nation." That this treaty, which was a harsh treaty, is now seen as the basis of Native life. And I read that, I think a page of the Medicine Creek Treaty was brought to Tacoma a couple years ago, and that among Native Americans, at least many Native Americans, they consider this treaty sacred, and that at nighttime they put a blanket over it to protect it. And so, in a way, much good has come from this treaty, even though it was very difficult for the people involved with it. And I think it proves that history is so important to us now that we need to remember it, learn from it, and then maybe do a better way in the future. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we are going to move on to our Q&A portion of the talk. So we do already have one question online, so it'll give you folks a moment to think of your questions if you have any. And then what I'll do is if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll come over with the microphone so that folks at home can hear your question as well.
Okay, the online question is, why is the Muckleshoot Reservation shaped in squares?
Shaped in squares.
Oh, okay. Muckleshoot Reservation, actually, the Muckleshoot people were not part of the Medicine Creek Council. And so the original reservations did not include Muckleshoot. But at the Fox Island Council, they recognized that the Muckleshoot people had not been worked with. And so they added that reservation at the Fox Island Council and the proclamation in 1857. Why was it done in blocks? Probably because it's easier to survey. Yeah. I think it was arbitrary, just the surveyor. And it was done. And so in a way, it comes from the Medicine Creek indirectly.
Great presentation, appreciate it. Do you know if Weymouth and Leschi had the same mother or the same father?
Oh, okay.
And then also, I believe Cynthia Ayala is a blood relative of Weymouth, if I remember right.
Yeah, yeah, okay. They had the same father, and and he originally lived. He was a Nisqually Indian that lived in the Kitsap Peninsula, then moved down to Michelle Creek area. So they had different mothers. Cynthia Ayala, there's other siblings of Leschi and Weymouth, and I think there's a sister that Cynthia Ayala is descended from. There's no direct descendant of Leschi today, but Weymouth did have two sons. They are descendants of Weymouth. What makes it confusing is that later years, Weymouth's sons took the name of Leschi to honor Leschi. So anyway, so you have George Leschi, who is actually the son of Weymouth. But anyway.
Okay, we have another online question. Somebody is asking, where in Lakewood is the Leschi stone located?
Where in Lakewood is the Leschi stone located?
Okay. It's at a small shopping center there, is my best answer. I don't know Lakewood particularly well, so I don't know exactly how, like, directions to get to it, but it's a small shopping center, and in Lakewood, and it was, I think one reason it was there, located there, was that the Fort Steilacoom officers refused to have the execution done on Fort Steilacoom property, so they insisted that it would be done outside their land.
So somewhere, I don't remember where, I read that the Nisqually are from Guatemala with a very different temperament, much more Pacific than the other tribes, the surrounding tribes. And to some degree, that because of that, they were maybe signing the treaty with a much more Pacific sense, that they weren't able to be as assertive as the surrounding tribes that really participated in the war. Is that, do you know about that, or is that correct? Or
Okay,
and they also have a very different physical look than the other natives.
That one I'm not sure of. The thing is, it's hard to think back. At that time, there seems to be almost a racist attitude towards Native Americans, and there was racist, towards Native Americans, but there was this sense that certain Native Americans were superior to other Native Americans, and so I've seen quotes that said, like, well, Leschi did not have a flattened forehead, and he looked more like the Indians or Native Americans of Eastern Washington or of the Great Plains, and it seems to me that they were trying to pay him a compliment, but to my knowledge, the Nisqually were very similar to the other peoples of this area, and that there were nothing especially physically different from them, from the Puyallup or the Squaxin, or that they were united by intermarriage, language, culture. So I think Leschi himself, his character made him different, but I think physically he was, Nisqually. He was Native American. It was nothing unusual about him.
Of course, Guatemala is also Americas,
so yeah.
It's not that they were not native to the Americas.
Yeah, I don't think there's any tie between. No, I don't think so. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, this question has two parts. The first part of the question is, how did the indigenous travel routes across the Chamber Prairie, such as the North-South Ridge Corridor and the East-West Yelm route, shaped shape later settler roads? And the second part of the question is, are these routes, trails still visible in today's landscape? I can repeat part of that if you would like.
Okay. How did they travel across the land, across the prairies and stuff? Okay.
How did that shape later settler roads?
Okay. First off, I should say that transportation in that time, the quickest way was by canoe. That if a person was in a hurry or wanted, they do it by canoe. Rivers, Puget Sound and stuff. Land travel was slower, much slower, and if you look at the land survey maps of the 1850s, which the Public Land Office and the Department of Natural Resources have, you can see trails. And the most famous one, the one I'm familiar with, is the Cowlitz Trail. And that is, of course, a trail used by the settlers, Hudson's Bay Company, but of course by Native Americans. And it is noted the one area that's easiest to follow is near Tenino, going from Tenino over to Deschutes River to Tennequot Prairie. If you go along the military road by the U.S. government was built on top of the Cowlitz Trail, that branch of it. So yes, the settlers did use those trails, and some became roads. The trail that came up north to Tumwater and Olympia, of course, became 99, Old Highway 99.
That was very informative. Thank you so much. I have a question about reservations. But first, I would like to say that I have heard recently that the word of that treaty has spread internationally, and that it's somewhat of a model for. Maybe you can verify that as part of the question. But my question is about the reservations themselves. You said that the treaty led to the formation of reservations maybe here. Did the treaty have an impact on reservations in other places in the U.S.?
Okay. Is Medicine Creek internationally known? It probably is because of the consequences of it, of the fish wars and the conflict. There's other treaties all across the country. And when the relationship between the U.S. government and Native Americans is a very complicated one. And I would say treaties form part of it, not the complete story. There's things like the Cherokee removal from the southeast U.S. The history's different down there. I would say that the Medicine Creek Treaty was based on treaties that was done earlier. So it was not like the first treaty. There were earlier treaties across the country. And they actually used models of treaties done in the Midwest for the Medicine Creek Treaty. It's very famous. It was the first in Washington. And its impact has been great in this whole region. I think if you look from a national, international, they would say these other treaties were important too. So.
Somebody online is asking, does it seem to you there was real intent by Stevens not to let things rest, but to retry Leschi because he was found innocent in the first trial?
What was that? Oh, okay, I know. I can't quite. It's something about the mistrial.
So he was retried.
Yes.
Yes, and that he was.
Oh, okay. The question is, did he leave to the retrial of Leschi? There was a mistrial, and then there was a second trial. At that point, Stevens was not here in Washington Territory. He's back in D.C. as territorial delegate. I think it reflects Stevens' viewpoint, but also the viewpoint was held by some other governmental leaders too at this time. And the whole attitude was that certain leaders like Leschi were particularly guilty. You know, I don't agree with that, of course. But I don't think you can blame it personally on Stevens for that. By that point, he was gone from the scene here. But his influence, his ideas were shared by other people too.
Thank you. I was just going to comment, thinking about people coming in from the South, that Cecilia Carpenter, and I don't remember which source, the historian you mentioned from the Nisqually, talked about a tradition from time immemorial that people came up from the South.
Yeah. Yes, that's true. And it seemed like they came up from according to this one Nisqually tradition, the Nisqually people came up from the south, from the Columbia River, and maybe even from what is now California. And it relates also to the Tennequat Prairie, in which they came to that prairie. And the name is This Is the Best Yet, Tennequat. So yeah, it is the sense of movement into this area by the Nisqually people.
All right, folks. Well, that will conclude this evening's program. Can I get a round of applause again for Drew Crooks? Thank you for joining us this evening.